The Kansas prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, an ocean of tall grass that swayed beneath the summer sun like waves frozen in golden amber. Ethan Cole had been riding for 3 days, delivering a string of horses to Fort Larned, one of the scattered military outposts that dotted the frontier. At 35 years old, Ethan had built a modest reputation as an honest horse trader who knew quality stock and kept his word, traits that were valuable currency in a territory where a man's character often mattered more than the coins in his pocket. As Ethan approached the fort in the late afternoon, he noticed an unusual commotion near the main gates. A cluster of soldiers stood in a tight circle around something, their voices raised in what sounded like argument or confrontation. Ethan's instincts, honed by years of reading situations for signs of trouble, told him to simply deliver his horses and leave quickly. But curiosity and a nagging sense that something was wrong drew him closer, and what he saw made his jaw tighten with anger he hadn't felt in years. In the center of the soldiers stood a girl, no more than 10 years old, her dark hair braided in the traditional Cheyenne style, her clothing a mixture of native and settler garments. She was crying and struggling against the grip of a sergeant, who held her arm firmly while trying to push her toward a waiting wagon. An older woman, clearly Cheyenne, stood nearby pleading in broken English, her weathered face streaked with tears. A junior officer was shouting orders, his face red with frustration, while other soldiers looked on with expressions ranging from discomfort to indifference. Ethan dismounted and approached the scene, his voice calm but carrying the authority of someone not easily intimidated. He asked what was happening, and the junior officer, a lieutenant named Morrison, who was young enough to still believe that following orders absolved one of moral responsibility, explained with bureaucratic efficiency. The girl was named Sarah, daughter of a Cheyenne woman named Quiet River, and a soldier who had died 2 years prior. According to new federal policies regarding children of mixed heritage, Sarah was to be sent to a boarding school in Pennsylvania, where she would be educated in civilized ways and separated from what the government considered savage influences. Ethan looked at the terrified child, at her grandmother's desperate face, and felt something crack open inside him. He had seen too much injustice on the frontier, too many policies created by distant politicians who had never set foot on the prairie and who cared nothing for the real human beings affected by their decisions. He asked Morrison if the girl wanted to go, and the lieutenant responded that her wants were irrelevant, that this was federal policy designed for her own good, and that civilians should not interfere with military matters. But Ethan had never been good at staying silent when silence meant accepting cruelty. He pointed out that the girl's father had served this country, that her grandmother was the only family she had left, and that tearing them apart served no purpose, except satisfying some bureaucrat's notion of proper civilization. Morrison's face hardened, and he told Ethan to leave immediately or face charges of interfering with federal authorities. The sergeant tightened his grip on Sarah's arm, and the girl cried out in pain and fear. What happened next would change Ethan's life forever. Moving with the quick decisiveness that came from years of handling unpredictable horses and difficult situations, Ethan stepped forward and took Sarah's other arm gently but firmly. He told Morrison that he was taking the girl, that what they were doing was wrong regardless of what papers said, and that if they wanted to stop him, they would have to do it in front of witnesses and God. The soldiers froze, uncertain how to respond to such direct defiance. Morrison reached for his sidearm, but an older sergeant put a hand on the lieutenant's shoulder and shook his head. Recognizing that shooting an unarmed civilian over a child custody dispute would create problems far worse than letting one girl go. In that moment of hesitation, Ethan lifted Sarah onto his horse, spoke quickly to her grandmother, in the few Cheyenne words he knew, promising he would keep her safe, then mounted behind the girl and rode away from the fort at a controlled pace that suggested confidence rather than flight. His heart hammered against his ribs, and he expected to hear shots or pursuit at any moment, but neither came. The soldiers stood frozen by the unexpectedness of his action and the moral complexity of the situation, giving Ethan precious minutes to put distance between himself and the fort. Only when he was a mile away did Ethan allow himself to fully process what he had done. He had just defied military authority, effectively kidnapped a child in federal custody, and made himself a fugitive from the law. There would be consequences, serious ones that could include prison or worse. But as he felt Sarah's small body trembling against him, heard her frightened breathing slowly calming as they rode across the open prairie, Ethan knew he had made the only choice his conscience would allow. Sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking laws that were themselves broken. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the endless grass in shades of orange and gold, Ethan turned his horse toward his homestead, a small claim about 20 miles from the fort, where he had built a life of honest work and simple independence. Sarah had stopped crying and now sat quietly, occasionally looking back as if expecting pursuit. Ethan spoke to her in a calm voice, mixing English with the limited Cheyenne he had picked up over years of trading with various tribes. He told her he would protect her, that he would find a way to return her to her grandmother, and that she need not be afraid while she was with him. The girl looked up at him with dark eyes that held both fear and a glimmer of hope, and nodded slowly. She told him in careful English that her name was Sarah Winterhawk, that her grandmother had taught her to be brave like the hawk that soars above the prairie, and that she did not want to go far away to a place where she would never see her family again. Ethan felt the weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders like a physical burden. He had saved this child from immediate trauma, but now he had to figure out how to protect her from a government that had the power to take her by force and punish anyone who stood in the way. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast Kansas sky, Ethan and Sarah arrived at his homestead, a modest cabin with a small barn and corral where his remaining horses nickered in greeting. Ethan helped Sarah down from the horse and led her inside, lighting a lamp that pushed back the darkness and revealed a simple but tidy living space. He prepared a meal of bread and stew, gave Sarah a blanket, and told her she could sleep on his bed while he kept watch. The girl ate hungrily, exhaustion finally overcoming fear, and within an hour she was asleep, her breathing soft and steady. Ethan sat by the window, his rifle across his lap, watching the prairie darkness and thinking about what tomorrow might bring. He knew the military would come looking for Sarah, that Lieutenant Morrison would not let this defiance go unanswered, and that his small homestead could not withstand a determined effort to take the girl by force. He needed a plan, needed allies, needed something more than just courage and moral certainty. As the night deepened, and the prairie whispered with wind and distant animal sounds, Ethan made mental calculations and considered options, knowing that dawn would bring a reckoning he could not avoid. Ethan woke to the first grey light of dawn, though he had barely slept more than an hour in scattered intervals throughout the night. Every sound had brought him to full alertness, his hand moving instinctively to the rifle beside him, but the night had passed without incident. Sarah still slept peacefully on his bed, curled beneath the blanket with the deep exhaustion of a child who had cried herself empty. Ethan stood quietly and moved to the window to check on his horses, a morning ritual that usually brought him satisfaction and peace. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. The prairie around his homestead, which should have been empty except for grass and sky, was filled with soldiers. Not just a small patrol or a squad sent to retrieve a runaway girl, but what appeared to be an entire regiment, at least 200 men arranged in precise military formation surrounding his property on all sides. They had arrived silently in the pre-dawn darkness and positioned themselves with professional efficiency, creating a perimeter that made escape impossible. Cavalry units sat mounted on the flanks. Infantry soldiers stood in neat rows with rifles at the ready, and several officers on horseback waited in the center, clearly visible as the growing light revealed the full scope of the situation. Ethan felt his stomach drop as the implications crashed over him. This was not just about retrieving one child. This was about making an example, about demonstrating that civilian defiance of military authority would not be tolerated, about showing the entire territory what happened when someone challenged federal power. Lieutenant Morrison had clearly escalated the situation beyond any reasonable response, and now Ethan found himself in a standoff that he had no realistic way to win. He could not fight his way out, could not negotiate from a position of strength, and could not even run without abandoning Sarah to the very fate he had tried to prevent. Behind him, Sarah stirred and woke, immediately sensing the tension in Ethan's posture. She climbed from the bed and came to the window, and when she saw the soldiers surrounding them, Her small hand found Ethan's and gripped it tightly. Her voice was surprisingly steady when she spoke, telling Ethan that she was not afraid as long as he was with her, that her grandmother had taught her that courage meant facing fear rather than running from it. Ethan looked down at this brave child, who had already endured so much, and he made a silent promise that whatever happened today, he would not let her face it alone. A white flag appeared among the soldiers, and a single officer rode forward slowly, stopping about 50 yards from the cabin. He called out in a voice that carried clearly across the morning air, identifying himself as Colonel Harrison, commander of Fort Larned, and requesting that Ethan come out to talk. The tone was formal but not hostile, suggesting that perhaps there was still room for dialogue, rather than immediate confrontation. Ethan told Sarah to stay inside and keep away from the windows, then stepped out onto his small porch, with his hands clearly visible and empty, showing that he came in peace even if he could not come in surrender. Colonel Harrison was older than Morrison, perhaps in his 50s, with grey in his beard, and the bearing of someone who had seen enough conflict to understand its true costs. He dismounted and walked closer, stopping at a respectful distance, and regarded Ethan with eyes that showed intelligence and something that might have been sympathy. The colonel spoke plainly, acknowledging that Ethan had put himself in an impossible situation by taking the girl, that Lieutenant Morrison was demanding immediate arrest and prosecution, and that the entire command structure was watching to see how this would be handled. Harrison said that he personally understood Ethan's motivations, that he had children of his own, and could imagine the distress of seeing a child torn from family, but that personal feelings could not override federal policy and military discipline. Ethan listened carefully, then responded with equal honesty. He explained that he knew he had broken laws, that he understood consequences would follow, but that he could not stand by and watch a terrified child be taken against her will from the only family she knew. He described Sarah's situation, her father's service to the country, her grandmother's love and care, and the cruelty of sending her thousands of miles away based on policies made by people who had never met her and did not care about her individual circumstances. Ethan asked the colonel directly whether following orders that caused unnecessary suffering was truly more important than exercising judgment and compassion in situations that called for wisdom rather than rigid compliance. Harrison listened without interrupting, and when Ethan finished, the colonel was silent for a long moment, clearly wrestling with competing principles. Finally, he admitted that he found the boarding school policies troubling, that he had seen firsthand how they destroyed families and caused lasting harm while claiming to provide help. But he also explained that he was a soldier, bound by oath to follow lawful orders, that the entire military structure depended on discipline and hierarchy, and that allowing civilians to defy authority with impunity would create chaos that could endanger far more people than it saved. He offered Ethan a compromise: surrender Sarah now, accept arrest without resistance, and Harrison would personally ensure that Sarah's case received special review, that her grandmother's wishes were considered, and that perhaps alternative arrangements could be made that did not involve sending her so far away. Ethan felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Harrison's offer was probably the best he could hope for under the circumstances, and continuing to resist would only make things worse for everyone, especially for Sarah. But he also knew that once he surrendered the girl, he would have no control over what happened next, that promises of review and consideration might evaporate once the immediate crisis was resolved, and that Sarah would once again be at the mercy of a system that had already demonstrated its willingness to prioritize policy over people. As he stood there in the growing morning light, surrounded by hundreds of soldiers and holding responsibility for one frightened child, Ethan searched desperately for a third option that his mind could not seem to find. Then Sarah herself made the choice for him. She stepped out onto the porch despite his instructions to stay inside, moving to stand beside Ethan with her small hand in his. She looked directly at Colonel Harrison and spoke in clear English that showed she understood far more than anyone had given her credit for. She said that Ethan was a good man who had shown her kindness when others showed cruelty, that she did not want him punished for protecting her, and that she would go with the soldiers if they promised not to hurt him. Her voice wavered but did not break, and her courage in that moment was more powerful than any weapon or strategy Ethan could have employed. Harrison looked at the girl with an expression that mixed respect with deep discomfort. Here was a child willing to sacrifice her own wishes to protect someone who had shown her compassion, demonstrating a maturity and selflessness that put the entire military response to shame. The colonel turned and called for Lieutenant Morrison to join them, and the young officer rode forward with poorly concealed satisfaction at what he clearly saw as inevitable victory. But Harrison surprised everyone by addressing Morrison with stern authority, ordering him to return to the fort immediately and prepare a full report on the original incident, including why such an extreme show of force had been deemed necessary for retrieving one child. Harrison then turned back to Ethan and Sarah and made a decision that would cost him politically, but which his conscience demanded. He announced loudly enough for all his troops to hear that he was suspending Sarah's transfer to the boarding school, pending a formal review of her case, that she would be returned to her grandmother's custody at the Cheyenne camp, and that Ethan would face no charges provided he agreed to appear as a witness in the review process. Morrison began to protest, but Harrison cut him off with a look that made clear the discussion was over. The colonel explained that his authority included discretion in implementing policies, and that he was exercising that discretion based on the specific circumstances of this case. The relief Ethan felt was so intense it made him dizzy, but he kept his expression controlled as he thanked the colonel and agreed to all conditions. Sarah began to cry, but these were tears of joy and release rather than fear. Harrison ordered his troops to stand down and prepare to escort Sarah back to her grandmother, but he took a moment to speak quietly to Ethan before leaving. The colonel said that what Ethan had done was both foolish and brave, that it had forced Harrison to confront questions about justice and orders that he had been avoiding for too long, and that sometimes it took a civilian's defiance to remind soldiers what they were supposed to be protecting in the first place. The journey back to the Cheyenne camp where Sarah's grandmother lived took most of the day, with Ethan riding alongside the small military escort that Colonel Harrison had assigned. The colonel himself had returned to Fort Larned to deal with the administrative and political fallout from his decision, leaving a trusted sergeant named William Brooks in charge of ensuring Sarah's safe return. Brooks was a career soldier who had served on the frontier for 20 years, and his weathered face showed the kind of wisdom that came from seeing both the best and worst of human nature in difficult circumstances. As they rode across the prairie, Brooks spoke candidly with Ethan about the broader situation facing children like Sarah throughout the territory. The federal boarding school policies were not motivated by simple cruelty, Brooks explained, but by a misguided belief that forced assimilation was kindness, that indigenous cultures were doomed to extinction, and that the only way to save native children was to remake them into copies of white settlers. The sergeant had watched these policies destroy families and communities over the years, and he had grown increasingly troubled by the gap between official justifications and actual outcomes. Harrison's decision to suspend Sarah's transfer was a small act of resistance against a much larger system, and it had taken tremendous courage for the colonel to risk his career for one child. Ethan listened thoughtfully and asked what would happen during the formal review process that Harrison had mentioned. Brooks admitted that the outcome was uncertain. Sarah's case had some factors working in her favor: her father's military service, her grandmother's clear ability to provide care, and now the public attention that Ethan's dramatic intervention had generated. But there were also powerful forces pushing for strict enforcement of assimilation policies, including politicians who built their careers on promising to civilize the frontier, religious organizations that ran many of the boarding schools and profited from federal contracts, and military officers like Morrison, who saw any deviation from policy as dangerous weakness. The review would require testimony from multiple parties, documentation of Sarah's living situation, and ultimately a decision by officials who might care more about precedent than about individual circumstances. Brooks suggested that Ethan should prepare to advocate strongly for Sarah and her grandmother, that having a respected white civilian vouch for the girl's well-being would carry weight that Quiet River's testimony alone could not. It was an uncomfortable truth that reflected the prejudices of the time, But Ethan agreed without hesitation, knowing that he had committed himself to seeing this through to whatever end it required. As they approached the Cheyenne camp in the late afternoon, Ethan saw Sarah's posture change, her back straightening and her face lighting up with anticipation. The camp was a collection of traditional lodges and more recent canvas tents, home to a band of about 50 people who were trying to maintain their way of life while adapting to the harsh realities of reduced territory and diminished buffalo herds. Children played near the edge of camp, and women worked at various tasks, but everyone stopped what they were doing when they saw the military escort approaching with Sarah riding alongside Ethan. Quiet, River emerged from one of the lodges and ran toward them with a speed that belied her age, her face transformed with joy and relief. Sarah practically leaped from her horse and flew into her grandmother's arms, and the two held each other with an intensity that needed no translation. The reunion was so powerful and genuine that even the soldiers who had accompanied them seemed moved, their expressions softening as they witnessed the obvious love between grandmother and granddaughter. Ethan dismounted and stood back respectfully, feeling that he had intruded enough on family matters and that his role here was finished. But Quiet River would not let him leave so easily. She approached Ethan with Sarah still clinging to her side and spoke in Cheyenne, which Sarah translated haltingly. The grandmother thanked Ethan for his courage and kindness, said that he had honored the memory of her daughter and son-in-law by protecting their child, and offered him the hospitality of their camp for as long as he wished to stay. The formal offer carried weight beyond simple politeness. It was recognition that Ethan had placed himself at risk for their family, and that such actions created bonds that transcended cultural boundaries. Ethan accepted gratefully, recognizing that building a relationship with Quiet River and understanding Sarah's home life would be important for the upcoming review process. Sergeant Brooks and his men departed after ensuring Sarah was safely delivered, and Ethan found himself welcomed into the Cheyenne camp as an honored guest. Over the following days, he learned about their daily life, their struggles to maintain traditions while adapting to changing circumstances, and the tight-knit community bonds that supported families like Quiet River and Sarah through difficult times. What impressed Ethan most was the educational approach he observed. Sarah was learning traditional skills from her grandmother and other elders, knowledge about plants, animals, seasons, and survival that was sophisticated and practical. But she was also learning English, mathematics, and other subjects from a young Cheyenne man named Thomas, who had attended a mission school before returning to his people. The camp had created its own informal education system that honored both their heritage and the practical reality that children would need to navigate an increasingly settler-dominated world. It was exactly the kind of balanced approach that the federal boarding school system rejected in favor of complete cultural erasure. Ethan spent considerable time documenting everything he observed, taking notes that he could use in his testimony during the review. He wrote about Quiet River's devotion to Sarah, the girl's obvious happiness and health in her grandmother's care, the educational opportunities available in the camp, and the strong community support that surrounded the family. He also gathered statements from other camp members, building a record that would demonstrate Sarah's well-being and the injustice of forcibly removing her from this environment. One evening, as Ethan sat with Quiet River and Sarah outside their lodge, watching the sun set over the prairie, the grandmother spoke through Sarah's translation about her daughter, Sarah's mother, who had died from illness shortly after Sarah's birth. She described a woman who had loved a soldier despite the complications that relationship brought, who had wanted her daughter to know both of her heritages, and who had made Quiet River promise to raise Sarah with knowledge of both worlds, taking Sarah away to a boarding school that would teach her to be ashamed of her. Cheyenne blood would betray that promise and dishonor the memory of a mother who had wanted something better for her child. Ethan listened with growing conviction that what he had done, despite its legal complications, had been profoundly right. Sarah deserved to grow up knowing who she was, where she came from, and the full richness of both her heritages. The boarding school system would strip away half of her identity and leave her feeling incomplete and displaced, belonging fully to neither world. But here in her grandmother's care and surrounded by community, she had the chance to become someone whole and integrated, someone who could honor both sides of her family and navigate between cultures with confidence rather than shame. As the review date approached, Ethan prepared to present the strongest possible case for allowing Sarah to remain with her grandmother. He knew the outcome was far from certain, that powerful forces opposed any deviation from standard policy, and that his own credibility as a civilian who had defied military authority might work against him. But he also knew that Colonel Harrison's courage in suspending the transfer and ordering a genuine review had created an opening, a chance for individual justice to prevail over bureaucratic rigidity. Everything now depended on whether the review panel would have the wisdom to see Sarah as a real child, with specific needs, rather than as a policy case to be processed according to standard procedures. The formal review was held at Fort Larned 3 weeks after the standoff at Ethan's homestead, in a large room that had been arranged to resemble a courtroom despite having no official legal authority. The review panel consisted of Colonel Harrison, a representative from the Bureau of Indian Affairs named Mr. Thornton, who had traveled from Washington specifically for this case, and a civilian judge from the nearest territorial court who had been asked to provide legal perspective. Lieutenant Morrison sat to one side as a witness, his expression making clear that he still viewed Ethan's actions as criminal defiance, deserving punishment rather than principled resistance worthy of consideration. Quiet River attended with Sarah, both dressed in a mixture of traditional and settler clothing that reflected their genuine attempt to navigate between cultures. Several members of the Cheyenne camp had also come to show support, sitting quietly in the back of the room but creating a visible reminder that this decision would affect an entire community, not just one girl. Ethan sat near the front, his testimony prepared but his heart heavy with the knowledge that Sarah's future would be decided by 3 men who had never lived in her world and who might not be able to see past their own assumptions about what constituted proper upbringing. The review began with Lieutenant Morrison presenting the military's original case for sending Sarah to the Pennsylvania boarding school. He cited federal policies regarding the education and assimilation of indigenous children, argued that Sarah's mixed heritage made proper placement particularly important, and claimed that leaving her in the Cheyenne camp would condemn her to poverty and ignorance, rather than providing opportunities for advancement. Morrison's presentation was bureaucratically precise but emotionally cold, treating Sarah as a policy problem to be solved rather than as a child whose well-being should be the primary concern. Mr. Thornton from the Bureau of Indian Affairs spoke next, and his testimony was more nuanced but ultimately aligned with Morrison's position. He acknowledged that the boarding school system was not perfect, that there had been problems with some institutions, but argued that the overall policy reflected the government's responsibility to prepare indigenous children for what he called the inevitable future. Thornton claimed that traditional indigenous ways of life were disappearing, that Sarah would face tremendous hardship if she could not function in settler society, and that providing her with education and cultural adaptation was ultimately an act of compassion rather than cruelty. Ethan felt his jaw tighten as he listened to Thornton's smooth rationalizations. The way the bureaucrat could describe cultural destruction as kindness and family separation as opportunity. But he kept his expression neutral, knowing that losing his temper would only undermine his credibility when his turn came to speak. He watched Sarah sitting quietly beside her grandmother, the girl's face showing the strain of hearing strangers, debate her fate as if she were an object to be disposed of according to policy, preferences rather than a human being with her own feelings and wishes. When Ethan was finally called to testify, he stood and approached the panel with a confidence he did not entirely feel. He began by describing the scene at the fort when he had first encountered Sarah being forcibly separated from her grandmother, the girl's terror and the grandmother's desperate pleas. He recounted his decision to intervene, acknowledging that it had been legally questionable but morally necessary, driven by witnessing injustice that he could not in good conscience ignore. He then presented detailed observations from his 3-week stay in the Cheyenne camp, describing Sarah's living conditions, educational opportunities, community support, and obvious emotional well-being in her grandmother's care. Ethan pulled out his notes and read specific examples. Sarah was learning traditional plant medicine from her grandmother that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of natural science. She was receiving regular instruction in English, mathematics, and history from Thomas, the young man who had returned from mission school. She had strong friendships with other children and was developing skills in both traditional crafts and practical frontier survival. He contrasted this rich, balanced upbringing with what the boarding school would provide: cultural erasure, separation from family, and education that taught children to be ashamed of their heritage rather than proud of their dual identity. But Ethan's most powerful testimony came when he spoke about Sarah's father, the soldier who had served this country and died in its service. He asked the panel directly whether a man who had given his life for the nation would have wanted his daughter, torn from her grandmother and sent thousands of miles away to be taught that half of her identity was savage and inferior. He suggested that honoring the service of soldiers like Sarah's father meant treating their families with dignity and respect, not as problems to be solved through policies that caused unnecessary suffering in the name of civilization. The room was silent when Ethan finished, and even Lieutenant Morrison seemed momentarily affected by the passion and logic of the testimony. Colonel Harrison asked several clarifying questions, focusing particularly on the educational opportunities Ethan had observed in the camp and whether Sarah would be able to function in broader settler society if she remained in her grandmother's care. Ethan answered confidently, arguing that Sarah was actually better prepared for navigating between worlds because she was learning to value and understand both cultures, rather than being forced to reject one entirely. Then, it was Quiet River's turn to speak, with Sarah serving as translator. The grandmother's testimony was simple but deeply moving. She spoke about her promise to her dying daughter to raise Sarah with love and knowledge of both heritages, about the joy the girl brought to her life and to the entire camp, and about her commitment to ensuring Sarah received education and opportunities while maintaining connection to family and tradition. Quiet River acknowledged that life in the camp was difficult, that resources were limited and the future uncertain, but argued that poverty of material goods was far less damaging than poverty of spirit and identity that came from severing children from their roots. Finally, Sarah herself was allowed to speak, though Mr. Thornton objected that a child's preferences should not override adult wisdom about what was best for her future. Colonel Harrison overruled the objection, saying that any review claiming to serve Sarah's interests should at least hear what those interests were from her own perspective. Sarah stood and spoke in English that was clear and mature beyond her years. She said that she loved her grandmother, that she was learning important things from both Cheyenne and settler teachers, and that she wanted to grow up knowing who her parents were and honoring both sides of her family. She acknowledged that the boarding school might teach her useful skills, but asked whether those skills were worth losing her grandmother, her community, and half of her identity in exchange. The review panel deliberated for over an hour, while everyone waited in tense silence. Ethan watched Sarah holding her grandmother's hand, both of their faces showing the strain of having their fate decided by others. He thought about the absurdity of a system that claimed to help children while ignoring their actual needs and wishes, that valued bureaucratic consistency over individual circumstances, and that measured civilization by how effectively it could erase diversity rather than celebrate it. Whatever the panel decided, Ethan knew this experience had changed him fundamentally, opening his eyes to injustices he had been able to ignore when they did not directly confront him. When the panel finally emerged, Colonel Harrison spoke as the senior member. He announced that after careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, the panel had decided to grant an exception to standard boarding school policy in Sarah's case. She would be allowed to remain in her grandmother's custody, subject to annual reviews to ensure her continued education and well-being. The decision came with conditions. Sarah must demonstrate progress in English and mathematics. Quiet River must maintain stable living conditions, and the Cheyenne camp must allow periodic inspections to verify compliance. But the essential victory was clear. Sarah would not be torn from her family and sent away to an institution that would teach her to be ashamed of who she was. The months following the review decision brought changes that rippled far beyond one girl's life. Though Sarah and Quiet River remained at the center of a story that was gradually becoming known throughout Kansas Territory. Word spread about the cowboy, who had defied an army to protect a child, about the colonel who had the courage to question unjust policies, and about the review that had placed individual circumstances above bureaucratic rigidity. The story was told and retold around campfires and in saloons, in military barracks and at Cheyenne gatherings, taking on slightly different meanings depending on who was telling it, but consistently emphasizing themes of courage, compassion, and the power of standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed impossible. Ethan returned to his homestead and his work as a horse trader, but his life was no longer defined by solitude and simple routines. People sought him out, some to hear the story directly from his own lips, others to ask advice about similar situations they faced, and a few to challenge him about interfering with government policies they believed were necessary and proper. Ethan handled all these encounters with the same steady calm he had shown throughout the crisis, neither boasting about his actions nor apologizing for them, simply explaining his reasoning and letting others draw their own conclusions. But the most significant change was the relationship that developed between Ethan and the Cheyenne camp. He became a regular visitor, welcomed not as an outsider but as someone who had proven himself through actions rather than words. He helped broker fair deals when the camp needed to trade for supplies, taught some of the young men advanced horse training techniques, and served as an informal liaison when misunderstandings arose between the Cheyenne and nearby settlers. This bridge-building role came naturally to Ethan, who had always believed that most conflicts stemmed from fear and ignorance rather than genuine incompatibility, and that patient communication could usually find common ground if both sides were willing to listen. Sarah thrived in the stability that followed the review decision. She continued her education with Thomas, making impressive progress in subjects that would serve her well in any context, while also deepening her knowledge of traditional Cheyenne skills and stories under Quiet River's patient guidance. The girl had a natural curiosity and intelligence that served her well in both worlds, and she was beginning to see her dual heritage not as a burden or source of confusion, but as a unique advantage that gave her perspectives and abilities that few others possessed. She often accompanied Ethan when he visited, serving as translator but also as a living example of what was possible when children were allowed to honor all parts of their identity. The annual review that had been mandated as a condition of Sarah's staying with her grandmother came and went with minimal difficulty. The inspector sent by the Bureau of Indian Affairs was thorough but fair, and he filed a report acknowledging that Sarah was receiving adequate education, living in stable conditions, and showing no signs of neglect or hardship that would justify removal from her grandmother's care. The inspector privately admitted to Colonel Harrison that Sarah appeared far happier and more well-adjusted than many children he had seen in the boarding schools, where homesickness, harsh discipline, and cultural dislocation created profound emotional problems that the institution seemed poorly equipped to address. Colonel Harrison himself had faced consequences for his decision to suspend Sarah's transfer and order the review. Lieutenant Morrison had filed a formal complaint alleging that Harrison had exceeded his authority and shown favoritism toward civilians over military policy. An investigation had been conducted, and while Harrison was ultimately cleared of wrongdoing, he received a private reprimand suggesting that future decisions should show more deference to established procedures. But Harrison wore that reprimand as a badge of honor, telling Ethan privately that if following his conscience occasionally meant bureaucratic criticism, that was a price he was willing to pay. The broader impact of Sarah's case was harder to measure, but potentially more significant than any individual outcome. Other families facing similar situations began to resist and advocate for alternatives, citing Sarah's case as precedent that exceptions were possible when circumstances warranted. Not all of these efforts succeeded. The boarding school system was too entrenched and too politically powerful to be easily challenged, but enough victories accumulated to create small cracks in what had seemed like an unbreakable policy wall. Lawyers began taking cases pro bono. Sympathetic military officers began finding administrative reasons to delay transfers, and some boarding schools themselves began implementing reforms that made them less culturally destructive and more respectful of students' heritage. Ethan watched these developments with cautious satisfaction knowing that systemic change was slow and difficult, but that every individual victory mattered to the families directly affected. He had never set out to become an advocate or activist. He had simply responded to one moment of injustice, with action guided by his conscience. But that single moment had revealed to him both the depth of institutional problems and the power of individual courage to challenge them. He began to see his role not just as protecting Sarah specifically, but as being part of a larger movement of people who believed that justice required challenging unjust systems rather than simply accepting them as unchangeable. 2 years after the standoff at his homestead, Ethan was asked to speak at a gathering organized by various reform groups concerned with Indian affairs and child welfare. He was uncomfortable with public speaking and initially declined, but Sarah herself convinced him to accept, arguing that his story could inspire others to stand up against injustice in their own communities. At the gathering, which brought together indigenous leaders, sympathetic settlers, military officers troubled by current policies, and religious groups that believed in reform rather than cultural erasure, Ethan spoke simply about what he had witnessed and why he had acted as he did. He described finding Sarah terrified and being forcibly separated from her grandmother, explained his reasoning for intervening, despite knowing it would bring consequences, and talked about what he had learned from spending time in the Cheyenne camp and seeing the sophisticated, loving environment Quiet River had created for her granddaughter. But most importantly, Ethan challenged the audience to examine their own responses to injustice. He said that most people, himself included, preferred to look away from difficult situations, to tell themselves that systemic problems were too big for individual action to matter, and to take comfort in following rules rather than following their conscience. But he argued that change only happened when enough individuals decided that certain injustices could not be tolerated. Regardless of what laws or policies said, the audience listened in rapt silence, and when Ethan finished, the applause was thunderous and sustained. Sarah stood in the front row beside her grandmother, both beaming with pride, and Ethan felt embarrassed but also moved by the response. After the speech, dozens of people approached him with their own stories, asking for advice or simply expressing gratitude that someone had been willing to take a stand. Ethan realized that what he had done resonated so strongly because it spoke to something fundamental, the belief that protecting children and honoring human dignity mattered more than following unjust rules, and that ordinary people had both the power and the responsibility to act on that belief. Years later, when Sarah was a young woman preparing to become a teacher herself, she would reflect on how that confrontation at the military outpost had changed the trajectory of her life. If Ethan had not intervened, she would have been sent to a boarding school where she would have been punished for speaking Cheyenne, taught to be ashamed of her mother's heritage, and separated from the grandmother who loved and raised her. Instead, she had grown up connected to both her Cheyenne and settler roots, had received an education that honored both traditions, and had developed into someone who could navigate between cultures with confidence and pride. The opportunity to become that whole person had come from one cowboy's courage to see her as an individual deserving protection, rather than as a policy case to be processed. Ethan never married or had children of his own, but he maintained close ties with Sarah and Quiet River throughout his life, serving as an honorary uncle who provided support, guidance, and unwavering advocacy whenever challenges arose. His homestead remained a place where people from different backgrounds felt welcome, where difficult conversations could happen without judgment, and where the values of courage, compassion, and justice were not just discussed, but actively lived. The solitary cowboy who had once valued isolation above connection had discovered that the most meaningful life came from building bridges between people and standing up for those who needed protection. On a warm summer evening many years after the crisis that had brought them together, Ethan sat outside his cabin with Sarah, now a confident young woman, and Quiet River, aged but still strong in spirit. They watched the sun set over the Kansas prairie, painting the endless grass in shades of gold and amber, and reflected on the journey that had started with one impossible choice and had grown into a legacy of courage and change. Sarah thanked Ethan again for what he had done, but he shook his head and told her the thanks belonged to her and her grandmother, who had taught him that family was built on love rather than blood. that justice required action rather than just good intentions, and that standing against injustice was never futile, even when the odds seemed overwhelming. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast Kansas sky, Ethan felt a peace and satisfaction that came from knowing he had lived according to his deepest values. He had risked everything to protect one frightened child, and in doing so, had discovered that courage and compassion could create ripples that extended far beyond any individual act. The army that had waited outside his door that dawn so many years ago had represented overwhelming power, but it had not represented justice. And in the end, justice guided by conscience had proven stronger than authority backed by force. That lesson, written in one girl's life and one cowboy's choice, would endure long after all of them were gone, inspiring future generations to stand up against injustice wherever they found it, and to remember that protecting the vulnerable was always worth whatever risks it required.